Hello, I'm Michael Lenox. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, and I'm also the author of Strategy in the Digital Age, Mastering Digital Transformation, where I talk about all the evolving technologies around AI and digital technology more broadly and how it's impacting business.
And what's the best advice you've ever gotten, Mike?
The best advice ever. Well, I can think of a funny one that I got, which is if you're ever offered a breath mint, you should definitely take it.
I love that. Well, you know what? Even though we're digital, I've always got my Mentos close by
There you
because you
go.
never know, right? Hopefully, you can't spell my coffee breath, can you, Mike?
No, not over the internet. If we haven't figured that out yet digitally, how to do that.
Yeah, no scratch and sniff or anything like that. So,
Yeah,
yeah, that's
exactly.
funny advice, but I think that's good advice, right? Even today when we're all digital and doing all this stuff, right? If somebody offers you something, there's probably a reason for that, right?
Exactly.
Right on, man. Well, congrats on the book. Lots of awesome stuff in here that we could cover here. So much to cover, but I have to ask. So, talk to me about what the heck digital transformation means to you first. How do you define that?
Yeah, I think the main premise of the book, where I see a lot of maybe misuses of digital transformation, is I think people think of it just merely as something your IT group does, and get your data in order. Maybe we move to the cloud and the like, and all those can be important parts of a digital transformation. But the main point of the book is that often what's happening with digital technology is fundamentally changing the basis of competition. It's creating new ways to create customer value. It's creating new ways and new business models that you can create, new ways of capturing value. And if you don't understand that, if you don't understand kind of some of the fundamental economics of platforms and what we call network externalities, you might miss the bigger picture. And so the point of the book is to really help you understand the strategy part of digital transformation, in addition to some suggestions on how you execute and implement that.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that is important. That is a fundamental shift, and that is different, right? For a lot of people, they're still not sure. They're still thinking, "Oh, well, maybe I'll just use ChatGPT, or
Right.
I should be on Threads, right? This week, that's probably the hot thing, right? And that
Right.
and that's not it. But I love that in the book you kind of lay out the six kind of core principles there that we're gonna talk about today. The six chapters. Part one, though, with three parts, is what impact does digital transformation have on the nature of competition? That's kind of what you alluded to there. And then how do I actually do it so
Right.
that we can flourish? So I think that's great. With that, I'd be remiss if we didn't start with just a little bit of AI talk here. So,
Yeah.
I mean, because AI is so fascinating. I mean, really, it's been around for a while, but yet until ChatGPT came out, it wasn't really in the common vernacular. A lot of, unless you're a geek like us, right? You probably didn't really think too much about it. So, why did ChatGPT shift that conversation, do you think?
Well, to date myself, I did systems engineering degrees, my bachelor's and master's, back in the early 90s. And even then, 30 years ago, we were talking about AI. We were talking about things like machine learning. We were talking about things like neural networks. These general concepts were out there. But I always like to say there were two things missing back in the early 90s. One, processing power. The processing power we possess today just dwarfs what we, had back in the 1990s. And then the second thing is data. And what you're seeing, especially with the generative AI, the large language models, is it takes a lot of data, right? It takes a lot of data to train these algorithms to do what they do. And so we've kind of finally, faced that maturity point where we're seeing, I talk a lot about in the book, the S curves of technology. And so you're hitting that sweet spot where you're getting exponential growth and improvement in the technology. So to your point, this has been around for a while. This isn't necessarily new, but clearly the release of ChatGPT 3.5 was a seminal moment that suddenly everyone began to wake up to what this technology can do.
Yeah. Well, I think bandwidth was a big part of it too. I mean, back
Yeah.
in the 90s at 9600 baud, we weren't doing much. I mean, it would take an hour to download a picture or
Right,
those
right.
crazy ASCII Christmas cards that people would send us.
I try to explain this
So,
to my kids and they just don't understand, like the old, AOL days of dial up.
yeah. Yeah, the V90 hooked up and now I got
Exactly.
23K more bandwidth. Woohoo, yay, right?
Yeah. Well, and I talk, and one of the things I talk about in the book is it's really kind of three core technologies. So one is processing power, and you probably are familiar with Moore's law, this idea that we see a doubling of processing power roughly every 18 months or so. Clearly bandwidth, especially now with the rise of 5G and the things coming down the pipeline, has been critically important. And then the third one I would say is storage. Our ability to store massive amounts of data, especially with cloud computing now, has allowed us again to start to make use of some of these tools like AI and analytics that just again didn't work even a decade ago.
Yeah, it's super incredible to see. I've been, I've worked in tech for a long time, and now I'm the sales side of that, and it's so interesting to watch how things have transformed there. So let's talk about that first part there. What impact does it have? So let's talk first about those platforms, Mike,
Yeah.
and what platforms are important now, and what do we need to think about?
Yeah, I think, at the core of the issue around platforms is a economist term we use called network externalities. And the idea, very simply, is that the value of a good or service increases as more people use it. So my favorite classic example is the telephone, right? What's the advantage of being the first person to own a telephone, right? Not much. There's literally no one to call. But as more people adopt telephones, the more valuable it becomes. Think about now Facebook or social media. The more people who sign on to a platform, the more valuable it becomes. And so in a platform age, we're seeing more and more of these types of network externality plays. Think of Uber or Airbnb. You're trying to match suppliers and buyers. So you need both a robust supplier network and a robust buyer network to make them work. But if you can get them off the ground and be successful, it's very hard for competitors then to kind of move into that platform space. And so again, when you think about what digital is doing in some of these sectors, in the extreme form, is creating winner-take-all markets where we see huge market power and market share by the big players. Of course, the big tech companies, Google and search, Meta in social media and the like. And that's just proliferating across a wide variety of industries.
Absolutely is. So with that, let's talk just a smidge about Threads there, because I think they
Yeah.
had an advantage that's
Yeah.
really interesting, right? They had 2 billion people that could then sprinkle down into 100 million active users in 7 days. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a big advantage that you and I don't have, right? I don't have a network of 2 billion users to then siphon into 100 million. Do you think do you think that's the only reason that they got ahead, or do you think that it was because we're kind of sick of Musk and don't want to play with Twitter, or both?
Maybe a little bit of both. I mean, I think what's interesting about social media in particular is the same dynamics that create those increasing returns and get people to all want to join the same platform can start to unravel very quickly when kind of public sentiment changes. So you take Facebook. I don't know if there's many people under the age of 25 who use Facebook at this point, and the rise of TikTok as a result. So I think what Threads was able to do is, to your point, see some problems with Twitter and some concerns people were having with Twitter. And then second, just leverage this massive social network they already have through Facebook and Instagram and the like, and basically instantly make it easy for people to sign up. Still remains to be seen. I'm probably optimistic that Twitter is so ingrained in so many parts of our society that it's going to be hard to dislodge. But we'll see a lot over the next 6 months or so on that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a week is absolutely too soon to tell, but it's interesting to me because I am seeing I saw about 25% of my network come to Threads, like just numerically, which
Just
is super
immediately, yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, almost immediately. Now, and I purposely did not follow all, so I wanted to see what would happen there because that was one of the default settings, and that just would basically duplicate my Instagram. And I'm not looking for duplication. I'm hoping for a new purpose. And that's what I don't necessarily see in Threads yet, is I don't see that new purpose, that new reason. I mean, the network externalities certainly are there. I mean, I'm seeing, more and more people join every day, but I'm not seeing necessarily a new use case for that. Are you optimistic that there is a new use case, or do you think this is just kind of a Me Too like Google maybe did with Google Plus?
Right, and if that's the case here, that's not a very successful,
No.
effort there. But no, but I think it highlights again the challenges of overcoming these inherent advantages once you build the network. Right, imagine if Threads didn't have the advantage of Instagram attached to it. Now you're like trying to rebuild a social network from scratch, and all those people you've gotten to sign on to your Twitter account or you've signed on to their Twitter account. suddenly, you've got to build that up from scratch. And so really, really hard to do. So in some ways, I think Threads almost proves the point that unless you have some inherent base of users to leverage, it's going to be very hard to supplant there. But I think you hit upon like a really critical piece here is that when it comes to new technologies, it has to create value in some new way, or it's very hard to get users to convert to the new thing. It's got to have some value proposition that differentiates itself from the what already exists.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Blue Sky came along, and I would argue Blue Sky's already dead now that it's not there. I mean, Blue Sky is almost the Plurk to Twitter as Threads is to Blue Sky, right? I mean, that Plurk didn't go anywhere. I think they ended up with 800,000 users. Maybe it was a million. I can't remember. But, Blue Sky is like, I mean, because I've got an account, and I'm looking at it, I'm like, well, that's useless. I mean, nobody's there. There's nothing to talk about. And so, so that's...
Give you another classic example where these, tell you how these things persist. As much as Apple has had incredible success, especially in the kind of iPod and iPhone era, they still are a very small portion of the laptop and desktop market, right? So Apple, I think, is still, single digits. And who dominates? Good old Microsoft, right? Bill Gates once famously said, it's like printing money when you control the dominant operating system. And they still do. Now, they botched it when it came to mobile. And you had kind of a resetting of the competitive environment there. But that platform of desktop and laptops, that's still dominated by Microsoft all these years later. And there's any number of people who complain about Microsoft, right? And whether they're as good as Apple and the Macintosh and the like, but it doesn't matter. They're still dominant.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, right? That network pressure event, I think that's difficult too. I mean, I can help my mom on her PC because I only charged her, she only paid $500 for it, as opposed to, my Mac, which is a couple grand usually.
Yeah.
Makes it harder to support.
This is something I talk about, quite a bit in the book, is what we call the strategist challenge, which is a very basic strategy framework in general. But it's the idea that valuable competitive positions come out of the intersection of your mission and values. That's absolutely critical as you're an organization, the opportunities the market provides, and then your capabilities as an organization. And what makes digitization so disruptive is often the opportunity set is moving away from where your historic capabilities have been. And what makes it challenging, especially for a lot of incumbent companies, is you just don't throw away everything you've done in the past and reinvent yourself anew. I can't think of a single example of a company who was able to successfully do that. So what you need to do is evolve your capabilities. How do you take what has made you successful in the past and evolve it in a way that you can succeed in the digital age? Unfortunately, I can come up with so many examples. The book talks about them of companies who failed in the face of these disruptions. Everyone from Kodak to Blockbuster Video and the like. So it's difficult. It's challenging to do, and hopefully the book is kind of providing some guidance. But I think one of the things that's an important point is that I say this all the time, but I run into companies who say things like, "I want to be the Google of X." And I look at it and I'm like, you're not going to be the Google of X. Google's going to be the Google of X. Like, they're much better positioned for what you're trying to do. You need to go back to the drawing board and maybe rethink how can you leverage what advantages you do have to find a viable position in an evolving marketplace. And that might be, like we were just saying with Apple, maybe it's a high end, high willingness to pay, almost niche position in a market. That's, that can be a very viable position in the market. Maybe you partner with one of these platforms and not try to like create your own platform. And that might be the best strategy for you moving forward. So a lot of what the book's trying to do is provide you some frameworks and guidance on really how to think about that positioning question, especially the first half of the book.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things I enjoyed the most is every chapter's got a framework, which helps make that really digestible. And really, even if you don't read the book, and I'm using air quotes here, and you just look through it, the frameworks are there to help you, and then you can go back and, okay, now how do I put that into play? I mean, I think it's almost Instagram light here for the book, which I really like and really appreciate. I think a lot of people will if they pick up a copy of the book. So nice work on that.
Yeah, thank you. No, I definitely wanted to have those worksheets in there to provide kind of a template and, like you said, summarize some of the things that are discussed in each chapter.
Yeah. Cool. So we've got two more in the first section. We've got competing and appropriating. I think let's talk about appropriation because I
Yeah.
think that is often the concern. You talked about oh well, why don't I just partner with one of these big people? But then we see Facebook basically rips off Twitter and
Right.
steals everything that they've got. Now they say they have no engineers that they took from Twitter to go on Threads. Whether or not that's true or not remains to be seen. But appropriation. What talk to me about that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these kind of economist terms that we use, but it really refers to this idea that, hopefully what you do creates value, and it creates value for numerous stakeholders, your customers, for your employees, for your shareholders, and like. But of course, you want to capture some of that value yourself, right, for your investors and like. And you just hit it right on the head, Phil, that all too often, if you're not careful, the value you try to create is appropriated by others. And so you mentioned, some of these platforms. Amazon Marketplace has been criticized for this. Apple and the App Store have been criticized for this, that they're extracting much of the value themselves for the third-party developers who are using these platforms. And it often comes down, to, again, kind of strategy 101, where can you create differentiated competitive advantage? Something that you do that others can't do, that make it very hard for them to extract those what we call rents from an economic sense. And again, that can be very challenging in the digital age. But there are lots of different ways in positioning. One of my favorite kind of older examples of this was Qualcomm. Qualcomm at one point competed in the handset market with Nokia and Motorola and the like, and they realized that they just weren't really being successful there. So they moved upstream and decided to be a focus almost entirely on innovation and patents that they then license to those downstream cellular or handset manufacturers. And they continue to do well with that kind of strategy. So again, trying to figure out what do we do well, what do we do best, and then how do we position ourselves in the marketplace to do that.
Well, that's a massive mindset set shift for a lot of these organizations, though, because they want to be, to your point, they want to be the next Google. They think they can be the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, when in reality, I mean, even Apple isn't the 1,000-pound gorilla in the PC space. So how do leaders help their teams start shifting that? How do they do that upstream and downstream to make sure that's successful?
Well, again, I think, this is all about this idea of competitive positioning. How do you foresee a position that you can achieve and have some appropriability associated with it and defend it, from others? That's the key here. I use this analogy that if your digital transformation efforts don't have that strategic position in mind, you could start to do a number of things that maybe are just unfruitful for you. And I've seen so many different applications and efforts that ultimately don't really create much value for companies. So I use the analogy of, improving the engines on the Titanic, right? Like if all you're doing is creating more efficient engines, you just hit the iceberg quicker or more efficiently. So knowing where to steer the ship is really critical. And then that should inform your digital applications and the efforts that you have. Too much money has been spent kind of chasing, cool things without really a sense of why this is valuable to you. And dare I say, I think we're going to be living through one right now, which is generative AI. I think generative AI is disruptive. I think it's going to have a wide impact across the economy. And I also think there's probably a lot of money being spent that's going to be poorly spent by companies chasing this who haven't really deeply thought through, well, wait a minute, what is this for? Is it something that can create value for us? Can we, is this just a necessity of doing business, or will this actually be a competitive advantage for us? That might be hard to achieve. And maybe it's OpenAI who ends up winning here at the end of the day and extracting most of the value from generative AI. So you've just got to be really thoughtful about this and not just dive in with both feet without thinking through how this plays out.
Yeah. Well, and it makes me laugh because that's why I think the title strategy, not tactics, in the digital age is so important, right? I mean, because we strategy first, like, how am I going to use this? Why is this going to help me? What's going to do with that? So I think that's super important point. I just want to double tap on that.
Well, and I just want to say, there is this kind of rhetoric sometimes, especially out of Silicon Valley, that you hear of like, well, we don't need strategy, move fast and break things. And, strategy is for old, slow, players. But I think it's a misunderstanding of what strategy is. Strategy, in my mind, is dynamic. It is not something you kind of set and then it's set in stone and off you go executing on that strategy. Strategy should be constantly tested and stress tested and fail fast and all those wonderful buzzwords, because it's important to have a direction, but you also need to test whether those assumptions still hold true and whether you need to pivot in a new direction here. But without that direction, then you get things like the dot-com boom, right? Where you had companies, touting their eyeballs, but without ever thinking through the appropriability question. The e-commerce at the end of the day is a great boon for consumers. It's actually lousy for business because it actually lowers barriers to entry, gives bargaining power to buyers. It makes it a much more, vigorously competitive marketplace for companies there. If you look at an Amazon, what I think Amazon figured out fairly early, to their credit, was you don't make money selling books online. What you do figure out is the logistics, right? They figured out the back end logistics that their massive warehousing and things that they've done. That's how they've gotten success. They're just able to get you that product cheaper than anybody else can. But the platform, the e-commerce part of it, just the pure kind of selling online, that's hard to make money at.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And Amazon continues to do that by buying, medical and other things that they route through that distribution center in new ways, which is super fascinating to watch.
Well, and this is something I talk about in the book that I do think is kind of scary in the digital age, is the primacy of data, right? Data is the new oil, as others have said, and it fuels our algorithms, it fuels our AI. And so what you're seeing, especially the big tech companies who have so much personal data on each of us, is that they're diversifying. They're moving into healthcare, they're moving into education, they're moving into finance, Apple Pay, and the like. And there likely are some boundaries to this, but there's a lot of industries that they could go in with the vast amounts of data that they have on each of us, which makes it just that much more competitive and hard for those who maybe already existing in those businesses to continue to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if they've only had one stream before and you're competing against 100. It's it's the Ghostbusters thing there. You cross streams and bang, now we're smacked together, and holy cow, that's power.
There you go. You go.
Cool. So let's jump into the second half. You're leading policy and transforming. You talked a little bit there about policy thinking, but let's talk a little bit about the importance of policy, because I think many of these organizations that are hopefully thinking more strategically because they read your book, right? They're doing that sort of stuff. They're putting policies down, but they're not quite sure like what the boundaries are. So talk to me about policy, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the main message is twofold. One, you need to be intentional about this. You can't put your head in the sand and ignore the vast societal impacts that digital is having. Everything from digital privacy or data privacy to cybersecurity to the negative impacts of, let's say, social media and the like, deep fakes and the like. These problems are out there. And what you typically see with technology is the policy environment, evolves along with the technology. Dare I say it, often lags and is not going to be the leader here. And you just have to understand that as an organization and as a business, and be very intentional about, one, what are your values? What do you believe in as an organization? And then two, how are you going to respond to these various concerns that are out there? So there's, again, at the end of the chapter, there's a whole, framework based on, stakeholder analysis that just, let's be really explicit. Who's being impacted by the choices we're making? What is our approach? And do we feel this aligns with our organizational values? The hard part, and I'm the first to admit, I'm not the one to be able to tell you what is right or wrong here in the digital age. I just want you to be intentional about it. And that's my main message. But I see companies struggling. You look at Google/Alphabet and Microsoft with generative AI. You can almost see, and they're talking about this, how much they're struggling about, man, this is a powerful technology that can go off the rails, but we got to keep advancing it. We got to keep pushing it forward. And that's just a fundamental tension that I don't think is easily resolved.
Yeah, I agree. The values is so important. If you don't have values, it's easy to just fiddle around here and go nowhere and spin your wheels. If you have values, you can be more strategic. You can think stronger, which is so interesting because breaking things and going fast almost is antithetical to the need for values, isn't it?
I don't know if I'd say it's antithetical. I think what it helps is maybe avoiding the slippery slope, right? hey, we're using a bunch of people's personal data already to customize products and provide value-added services. Maybe the customers love it, right? Maybe I love my Instagram feed or the recommended music on Spotify and the like. But then you keep pushing, right? And then what else can you do with this data? And what else can we do? The tech companies have spent, millions and millions of dollars hiring PhDs in psychology, not only to try to, basically understand your mental state, but actually influence it, right? The whole idea of nudges, right? Again, where do you feel comfortable and where do you not feel comfortable on that? I think the more you can force yourself to have those conversations and be explicit about it, the less you just kind of slide into things that at the end of the day you feel are, not very comfortable. Google, historically has had this, do no evil tagline that they've adopted. And I'm sure people will debate whether they have done evil or not. But in some ways, I like the general sentiment to just being kind of explicit. Like, let's be clear about what we're doing and try to understand where would we draw the line? And there always is a line. I think that's the part that I think business leaders need to recognize. Even the most, tech forward thinkers, I think, will recognize that there are some lines they feel like they shouldn't cross.
Yeah, I hope so, right? I hope so. Hopefully we don't go all Ready Player One and people are just shooting each other up and it's all crazy news, right?
Yeah, well, I talk about this in the book, and this is based on at least, leaders in AI who I really value their opinion. The Terminator scenario that a lot of the popular press likes to run with. That seems to me to be incredibly unlikely. This idea that AI will gain sentience and then decide to end the human race. I think the scarier proposition is that the AI is going to do exactly what we tell it. And that's scary because, we already see, like, do I want to create a generative AI chatbot that basically keeps you logged in, as many hours as possible so I can sell you advertising? People are developing that. And to your point, like, is that healthy? Is it healthy if people are in a virtual environment, they're all their waking hours? Probably not. And so it's fraught. It is a fraught age. But I think being realistic, you have to recognize that technology is out there. It is going to develop. I half jokingly like to say technology always wins. I can't think of an example where society just said no on a technology, right? Like we just, even obviously nuclear weapons, like we still pursued them. And that isn't necessarily a good thing, but it is the reality we often face. And again, the policy environment hopefully will co-evolve with AI as it starts to evolve here. Maybe put some guardrails on it, but it's hard to see. And I think right now, especially, companies are ahead of it. And so if they're sitting back saying, I can do anything I want until the government tells me otherwise, well, that's probably not a robust way to approach this.
Yeah, I agree. I think the line is still thick and bright, and I think companies just are ignoring the thickness and brightness of it.
Yeah, perhaps.
So unfortunately, well, cool. Well, before we get to the last part and we talk a little bit about transformation, I just want to let folks know where they can get more from you. MichaelLenox.com is where you want to go. Learn more about strategy in the digital age, learn about mastering digital transformation, all the great stuff we talked about today and more. His new book is fantastic. It's about strategic thinking, not just a bunch of tactics that may or may not work. So get strategic, get a copy of the book. So Mike, let's talk about transformation.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the last piece here. How do we really embrace that so that we can actually do the change?
Yeah, so I have the chapter before, right, is the one that's like all the dystopian, issues with technology and talks about that. So I wanted to end on a more positive note. But I actually believe that, this is a very powerful set of technologies that have evolved. And there's any number of places where this could be transformational for society. So pick your issue: healthcare, education. I do a lot of work on environmental issues and sustainability and decarbonization. There are some real uses of these technologies that are going to help us address some of these issues. So just to give you one maybe fairly narrow example, if we're going to try to decarbonize our energy generation, our electrical grid, and we're going to probably adopt wider and wider usage of renewables, To make that work requires likely what we call a distributed grid. And the idea here is rather than have a bunch of coal-fired power plants, we're now going to have millions of point sources of electricity. Solar panels on people's homes and commercial businesses. You have batteries in people's garages now with electric vehicles. All of that tied into a massive network called our electrical grid that will need to be trading electrons, if you will, in real time and also pricing them as you exchange them. That's a problem that is not solved by like people sitting at a spreadsheet. Like this is an AI problem, and there's a whole number of companies that have arisen who are trying to solve that problem using a combination of Internet of Things, bandwidth with cloud storage, and then ultimately AI with the massive amounts of data to solve that problem. Again, healthcare, the ability to predict certain outcomes by leveraging large data sets, really promising here. The ability to augment doctors and their prescriptions and the like, again, can be really powerful with AI. So again, this idea that if we embrace the technology and really think about how it can be used for good, it can be transformational.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, good stuff, Mike. If we're looking to get started on this, obviously pick up a copy of the book, but is there like a really fundamental, like one step that they can go so that we can get, just get started on the path? What would that be?
Well, I'll highlight something that's actually in like chapter 5, which is the digital transformation stack, as I call it, to be, with the cool kids in the software development area. So the idea is very simply four levels of the stack. One is your digital infrastructure. You need to start to think about how you organize your data. This is everything from cloud computing to the use of sensors, Internet of Things, and the like. The next level is your data and analytics capabilities. So this is everything from creating dashboards and the like, maybe using Microsoft BI or other applications for organizing your data, and then all the way to more higher end uses of analytics like AI, machine learning, autonomy, and the like. The third level of the stack is really where it gets real, which is what I would call the application level. All right, how are you going to use your data and the analytics that you have to create valuable applications, either internally to the organization or externally for customers and the like. So maybe it's for sales and marketing, maybe it's for HR, maybe it's for a business unit. But what are those applications? And then, not surprisingly, at the top of the stack is your digital strategy. And this gets back to this point, like, where are you pointing the ship? Where are you trying to go? How are you positioning yourself in the market? And then that should inform, the build out of all the other pieces. And unfortunately, all too often, I see companies begin from the bottom going up rather than the top going down. And I really do believe you got to start with the strategy.
Love that. Well, friends, start with the strategy. Pick up a copy of Strategy in the Digital Age. Go to michaellenox.com. Lenox is Lenox, and get to know Mike. Lots of great stuff today, Mike. Thank you so much for being so free and sharing it.
Phil, thank you so much for having me on your show.